The call that changed everything. The morning light bled gently across the polished glass windows of the penthouse suite, resting softly on the tired eyes of Keanu Reeves. He stood barefoot on the cool marble floor, coffee in hand, staring into a city that had grown louder and faster with each passing year. To the world, he was a legend, the beloved star of countless films, the humble icon known for his kindness and quiet strength. But to himself, in this still moment, he was simply a man wondering if the best parts of his story were behind him. It had been a long time since Keanu had done anything live. Years had passed since his last on-stage appearance, not for lack of offers, but for lack of desire. The industry had shifted, fans had grown louder, and somewhere between red carpets and scripted interviews, he had begun to feel like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own fame. He wasn't bitter, just tired, and alone in ways few understood. Then came the call. It was late March, the city humming with spring's first promise, when his manager, Laura, knocked on his door. She rarely did that anymore. Most things could be handled through text, emails, or forwarded calls. But this, she said, needed a face-to-face. "There's a charity gala," she said, placing a slim, embossed envelope on his kitchen counter. "Live audience, live cameras, global broadcast." Keanu raised an eyebrow, and Laura hesitated, then smiled, a flicker of something deeper in her expression. "Sandra Bullock's hosting it." He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the envelope, then slowly sat down. Sandra. It had been years since they'd spoken, not out of animosity, but out of life simply pulling them in different directions. The connection they once had, deep, magnetic, utterly unique, had been shelved away like an unfinished book both were afraid to reread. Too many years, too many unspoken truths. He gently picked up the envelope and opened it. The event was called Hearts Without Borders, a live, globally televised gathering to support displaced children, survivors of war, and victims of trauma. A night of hope, of stories, of truth, a cause too important to ignore. And just below Sandra's name, listed as host, was his own. She had requested him, not just as a guest, not as a cameo, but as a partner. A beat of silence passed before Keanu looked up. "She asked for me." Laura nodded. She said, "He makes people feel safe. We need that." For a moment, something stirred in Keanu, an echo of the old warmth, the familiar ease, the laughter they used to share between takes, under lights, behind closed doors when no one was looking. He hadn't realized how much he missed her until her name carried that much weight in his chest. He sighed long and deep. "When is it?" 3 weeks, she replied. "New York, full house, no filters, just hearts on sleeves." Keanu sipped his coffee again, now cold, and looked toward the skyline. The city buzzed with its morning energy, unaware of the decision being made in that quiet room above it all. "Book it," he finally said. 3 weeks later, Sandra Bullock stood backstage at the Lincoln Center, adjusting her mic, pacing in soft, deliberate steps. Her team moved around her like dancers, makeup, hair, sound, wardrobe. But her mind wasn't on the chaos. It was on the man she hadn't seen in 8 years. The man she had once, privately, desperately, almost told she loved before fear got in the way. When she found out about the event, she didn't hesitate. She had signed on in seconds, but asking for Keanu, that took something else. It wasn't about romance or fame or nostalgia. It was about energy, about truth. He was someone who could walk into a room and dissolve ego, someone who made the loudest stories feel quiet again. And Sandra knew the world needed that. So when she looked at the schedule and saw his name added beside hers, a wave of emotion rolled through her. Gratitude, nerves, regret, hope, all wrapped into a single exhale. And then, as if summoned by memory itself, she heard footsteps behind her, slow, familiar, unmistakably his. She turned, and there he was. Keanu in a simple black suit, his hair tied back, his eyes soft and knowing. No pretenses, no armor, just presence. Their eyes locked. Time didn't stop, it deepened. "Hey, Sandy," he said quietly, his voice like velvet and ash. She smiled, a little shaky. "Took you long enough." "I got lost," he replied, deadpan. She laughed, that same laugh that used to fill their shared trailers with warmth. And just like that, 8 years vanished between them. When the lights dimmed and the crowd hushed, the voice of the announcer filled the auditorium. "Please welcome your hosts, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves." The applause erupted like a storm held back too long. As they walked out side by side, two legends, two friends, two humans with stories still unfolding, something strange happened. The crowd didn't just clap, they rose. A standing ovation, before a single word had been spoken. Sandra blinked back emotion. Keanu nodded, humbled. They stood in silence for a beat, soaking it in, honoring it, before Sandra stepped to the mic. "Tonight," she began, her voice clear and strong, "we're not here as actors. We're not here as celebrities. We're here as people who believe in healing, in second chances, in the power of showing up for someone when they need it most." Keanu stepped forward, adding, "And we're here for the ones whose voices were taken, so we can give them a new stage, a new beginning." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. And thus began a night no one would forget. But the real story, the one behind the cameras, behind the lights, behind the applause, had just begun. Because somewhere in the middle of that performance, Sandra looked over at Keanu, the way he knelt beside a war survivor, the way he gently read a child's letter aloud, the way his voice broke ever so slightly when telling a real story of loss, and she knew. This wasn't just a reunion. This was a turning point. And somewhere deep inside, she realized that the most powerful love stories aren't always scripted, they're lived. And sometimes, after years of silence, all it takes is one night, one cause, one shared breath to begin again. Unscripted moments, unspoken truths. The lights in the Lincoln Center had barely dimmed after the first segment when something strange began to stir, not just among the thousands packed into velvet seats, but behind the stage, among the crew, the guests, and the organizers themselves. There was an energy, subtle yet undeniable, that pulsed through the air, an awareness that something different was happening. Not the scripted, over-rehearsed kind of televised perfection that people had grown accustomed to, but something raw and deeply human. It wasn't just that Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were on stage again. It wasn't just the nostalgia or star power. It was the way they looked at each other without needing to fill the silence, the way their presence spoke louder than applause, the way their shared stillness commanded a room used to noise. Backstage, camera operators whispered it was the most emotionally synchronized performance they had ever witnessed. Two people who didn't need lines to move hearts. Producers, who had prepped pages of dialogue and contingency cues, found themselves quietly stepping back, letting the moment breathe, letting the world watch a live unfolding of something bigger than performance. And in the center of that glowing moment stood Sandra, confident and graceful, reading a child's handwritten letter from a Syrian refugee camp. Her voice didn't tremble, but her heart clearly did, and it showed in the way her eyes softened and her hands held the paper as if it were made of glass. Then Keanu stepped forward with that familiar, humble stillness and read a poem written by a boy who lost his parents at sea. His voice cracked, not performatively, not for effect, but because sometimes even the strongest hearts break mid-sentence. And as the audience clung to every word, something powerful happened. People didn't just see stars, they saw real humans who dared to care deeply in a world that so often teaches detachment. A woman in the second row, a war widow from Ukraine, clutched her chest and wept silently. A young nurse from South Sudan backstage, invited to share her story, took off her earpiece and whispered to herself, "They see us." And it wasn't about pity or fame or headlines. It was about presence, about truth, about love. The second act was built around live testimonials. Survivors, doctors, social workers, war correspondents, all seated in a circle, sharing stories not for sympathy but for healing. When the camera panned to Sandra and Keanu again, now seated with the group, they weren't towering above anyone. They were listening, eyes locked on the speaker, hands often held tightly in their laps as if holding back storms. And Sandra, oh Sandra, when she gently reached for the hand of a teenage girl from Gaza who shared how her brother died shielding her from gunfire, the audience didn't applaud. They simply wept. Because what do you do when the truth is that raw? You honor it, with silence, with stillness, with breath. And then Keanu spoke, not from cue cards, not from a teleprompter, but from his heart. He told a story he'd never shared publicly, not even in interviews that begged for personal glimpses. He spoke of a young boy he met during filming in Haiti after the earthquake, a boy named Emmanuel who lost his entire family and still offered Keanu his only mango. "I asked him why," Keanu said, his voice steady, his eyes misted. And he said, "Because your eyes look tired." And fruit is for healing. The room, the world, fell silent. No camera could capture the stillness that followed, no editor could create that kind of hush. It was sacred. Sandra, visibly moved, leaned slightly toward him, not for show but because something in her heart had just remembered why Keanu was so rare. not because he had played heroes on screen, but because he carried the grief of 1,000 quiet kindnesses the world never saw. And for a brief moment, she saw the man she used to laugh with in trailers, the man who left her birthday flowers with no note, the man who once told her he believed real strength was being soft in a world that made you hard. And just like that, she wasn't just hosting a gala. She was seeing him again, with all the weight and wonder of who he had become. During the intermission, they returned backstage. The world was buzzing online. Hashtags exploded. Viewers around the globe were posting clips, quotes, weeping in their living rooms, but Keanu and Sandra didn't check their phones. They stood by a quiet hallway, alone for the first time that night. The noise of the world hummed behind the thick curtains, but here, in the soft glow of emergency lights and dusty backstage warmth, there was only them. Sandra leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You've changed," she said softly. Keanu looked at her for a long time. "Or maybe I've just become who I was always supposed to be." She smiled, touched but steady. "You know, I didn't ask you to come tonight to relive the past. I asked because—" She paused, eyes searching his. "Because you always made me feel like I could be more, not for cameras, not for crowds, but for myself." He didn't respond immediately. He just stepped closer, not touching her, not needing to. "You did the same for me," he said. "You still do." And there, in that pause, in that silence thicker than words, something old returned. Not in the way of forced romance or nostalgia, but in the honest recognition of a bond forged in quiet understanding. It wasn't about what they had missed. It was about what was still possible. When they returned to the stage for the final act, the crowd greeted them not with applause, but with reverence. You could feel it, how the energy had shifted, how they were no longer stars entertaining a room, but witnesses to something bigger. They invited the audience to light candles, thousands of tiny flames glowing in the darkness, each representing a name, a memory, a prayer. And as the lights dimmed and the candles shimmered like stars across the sea of faces, Sandra and Keanu stood at center stage, shoulders brushing, eyes wide with something sacred. And then, without warning, a young boy, one of the survivors brought in to represent displaced youth, ran across the stage and hugged Keanu tightly around the waist. No one stopped him. No one scolded, because love doesn't follow cues. Keanu, taken by surprise, dropped to one knee and embraced him fully, whispering something only the boy could hear. Sandra knelt beside them, her hand on the child's back, and the cameras for once didn't zoom in. They stayed still, respectful, bearing witness. When the boy stepped back, he said into the mic, "I was scared to be seen, but now I want to be like him." The crowd rose, not out of excitement, but because they couldn't sit anymore. They couldn't contain what was rising in them: tears, applause, reverence. People sobbed openly. Celebrities in the front row wiped away mascara. Old critics forgot their cynicism. And across social media, millions whispered the same thing. "We needed this." Sandra closed the night with trembling sincerity. "If this event proved anything, it's that we are not here to fix each other or to impress one another. We are here to see each other, to witness truth, to love with courage. And if even one person watching tonight feels less alone, then everything, every mile, every story, every tear, was worth it." Keanu stepped forward and took her hand gently, not for effect, but because she had just spoken something eternal. And as they bowed together, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, the world stood with them. Unscripted, unfiltered, unforgettable. The world was watching, but they were watching each other. The next morning, New York didn't wake up, it erupted. News outlets scrambled to cover what many were calling the most heartfelt moment in live television history. Social media platforms were flooded with a tidal wave of reaction videos, essays, threads, tributes, and quotes from the previous night's event. The hashtag #HeartsWithoutBorders had already crossed 200 million views by sunrise, but what truly captured the world's breath wasn't the show, it was the moments between the show. The glances, the pauses, the tears neither Keanu Reeves nor Sandra Bullock wiped away too quickly. Those seconds of silence where humanity filled the air heavier than words. Clips of Sandra comforting the Gaza girl or Keanu kneeling to hug the little boy were played on every screen from Times Square to Tokyo. But what truly shook the public, beyond performance or politics, was what they saw when the camera wasn't even trying to catch it. Keanu gently placing a hand on Sandra's back when she momentarily lost her breath during a survivor's story, and Sandra turning her head slightly, just slightly, to press her shoulder into his hand for half a second, as if to say, "I'm still here. I remember who you are." And while the world was dissecting every frame for clues of a romantic reunion, what they were missing was something much more sacred. This wasn't two Hollywood stars rekindling a flame for spectacle. This was two souls, long separated by distance, by life, by grief, now quietly orbiting again under the gravity of truth, purpose, and timing. Not the kind of timing controlled by agents or premieres, but divine timing, the kind that only shows up once both people have survived enough pain to meet in full honesty. Keanu sat by the window in his quiet hotel suite, away from the noise of articles and interviews, watching the city breathe beneath a clouded morning sky. His phone buzzed relentlessly, but he didn't touch it. His team had warned him that the public was demanding interviews, podcast appearances, late-night couch cameos. But he wasn't interested in talking to the world. He was still thinking about what Sandra had whispered to him just before the final bow. She had leaned in not for cameras, not for fan service, but with trembling vulnerability and said, "I forgot how much safer I feel in a room when you're in it." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't flattery. It was a confession. And he hadn't replied, not because he didn't have words, but because his heart was still catching up. Elsewhere in a high-rise suite overlooking Central Park, Sandra sat barefoot on the floor, her heels kicked into the corner, makeup from the night before still faintly marking her cheeks. Her assistant was trying to read out interview requests, donations data, and trending headlines, but Sandra wasn't listening. She held in her lap a photo, a candid shot someone had taken during the event, now going viral, of her and Keanu seated beside each other, hands not quite touching but close enough to suggest electricity. She stared at it, tracing the distance between their fingers in the image, thinking of the years between them, the mistakes, the silences, and the things they both never said when they should have. Fame had taught them both how to smile through heartbreak, how to walk red carpets with wounds still open, how to protect privacy even from people they loved. But it had also robbed them of time. Later that afternoon, they met again, not for a show, not for the press, but for coffee. Sandra arrived first, seated at a quiet table inside a small cafe in Soho, no security, no team, no pretenses. She wore sunglasses and a hoodie, the kind of outfit that whispered, "Don't look at me," while daring someone to. But she didn't need the disguise. The people inside glanced once and then respectfully looked away. The city, for all its noise, knew when to make space for real moments. Keanu entered 15 minutes later, dressed as simply as always, jeans, boots, long coat, carrying a book under one arm and 2 coffees in his hands. He had memorized her order from over a decade ago. And the fact that she smiled when he placed it down without asking confirmed something inside both of them. No matter how much time had passed, some things were simply intact. For the first few minutes, they didn't talk about the event. They didn't mention the applause or the child or the candles or the hundreds of millions of people watching. They just talked about the little things, the way the coffee here still tasted like cinnamon bark, the pigeons that always managed to steal someone's croissant, the weather that couldn't decide between rain or warmth. They eased into each other like worn gloves slipping onto familiar hands. There was no pressure to be interesting, just present. But eventually, silence led them to the real questions. "Do you ever regret not calling?" she asked, voice low, eyes on her cup. Keanu didn't flinch. "Every birthday, every holiday, every time I heard your name when you weren't in the room." Sandra nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "I thought I was protecting you by staying away. After Ryan died, I wasn't myself. I couldn't be light." He reached across the table, not dramatically, not to hold her hand, but to gently touch her fingers with his. "Sandy, I never needed you to be light. I just needed you to let me sit in the dark with you." Her eyes filled not from pain, but from the weight of hearing the very thing she'd needed all those years ago. In that quiet coffee shop, 2 of the most photographed people in the world sat completely unseen, not because they were hiding, but because they were finally allowing themselves to be visible to each other. Without roles, without history. Just now. They left that cafe without answers, without a dramatic promise of love, without some magic declaration. But they left with something more powerful, the decision to stop avoiding what still lived between them. Over the next few weeks, as the world replayed their gala appearances like it was a cinematic romance, Keanu and Sandra did something radical. They lived privately. No interviews, no statements. They didn't deny the rumors, nor did they confirm them. Instead, they met for dinners. They walked in parks. They sat in silence. They cried once together, watching a documentary about displaced children in Yemen. They began collaborating behind the scenes, working to turn Hearts Without Borders into a recurring foundation rather than a one-time event. And as they slowly rediscovered each other outside the spotlight, something gentle began to rise, not the fire of youth or the thrill of rekindled fame, but the quiet knowing that comes when two people, finally healed, finally open, find each other again in a time where they can love freely and with depth. The real turning point, however, didn't come from a stage or a screen. It came on a Tuesday morning. Sandra was filming a voiceover segment for a UNICEF documentary. Keanu had come with her not as a guest but simply as her person. He waited in the recording booth, reading quietly. When she finished, she walked out, removed her headphones, and looked at him. He looked up. And without a script, without planning, without performance, he stood, crossed the room, took her hand, and whispered, "I know this isn't the ending the world expects, but I'd like to be there for every ordinary chapter from here on out, if that's okay with you." Sandra, tears catching in her throat, nodded once, and that was it. Not a movie moment. A real one. No kiss for the cameras. Just two hearts, choosing the quiet path towards something lasting. And somehow, even though the world had watched their reunion, their real love story was only just beginning, far from the lights, far from the noise, in the sacred space between two people who finally stopped running from the truth. Someone from the past, something from the future. The days following their quiet recommitment unfolded not like a love story racing toward a kiss, but like the slow blooming of a flower long thought wilted. There were no grand gestures, no paparazzi ambushes, no social media clues to feed the frenzy. Instead, there were quiet afternoons in bookstores, Sunday mornings with shared silence and pancakes, late-night conversations on rooftops about how grief bends people, how fame isolates the soul, and how healing is often about simply being seen again. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were not chasing headlines. They were reclaiming time, piece by piece, memory by memory. But still, the world had not forgotten them. They had become, once again, symbols of resilience, of grace, of quiet love returning in the shadows of life's storms. And in this strange intersection of private truth and public expectation, an invitation arrived that neither had seen coming. It was a formal letter, gold-trimmed and hand-delivered. The United Nations was honoring Keanu with a Global Compassion Award, a recognition of his decades-long, often anonymous support of displaced children, education in post-conflict zones, and trauma-focused art programs for survivors of war. But there was more. The letter didn't just invite him to receive the award. It requested that Sandra Bullock present it to him live at the annual Peace and Humanity Summit in Geneva. The event would be broadcast across 70 countries, attended by world leaders, artists, survivors, and children from over 30 nations. It would be the first time they stood together on an international stage since the gala. Keanu read the letter once, then again. He didn't smile. He didn't panic. He just stood there in his kitchen, holding a cup of herbal tea gone cold, feeling the weight of the moment press gently into his chest. Sandra, when she received her copy, stood frozen near her piano. She traced the embossed seal with her fingers. She knew what this meant. The world wasn't just watching again, it was asking for something sacred. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to give it. They flew to Switzerland quietly, without fuss. No entourage, just two suitcases, a handful of books, and each other. On the flight, they sat side by side like ordinary people, watching the clouds stretch into horizons. At one point, Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder, not because she was tired, but because some hearts learn to rest best against one another. Keanu didn't move. He simply reached for her hand and held it gently, his thumb brushing the edge of her knuckle. No words, no tension. Just presence. Geneva welcomed them with dignity, not drama. The summit hall was grand but not ostentatious. Arched glass ceilings, rows of flags, seats filled not by elites but by survivors, children, peacemakers. People who had lived stories the world rarely tells. People who didn't care about Hollywood. People who cared about healing. As the event began, speeches flowed, some technical, some tearful. The lights dimmed when Sandra stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple black dress, no glitter, no excess. Her voice, when it came through the mic, was both steady and intimate. "When the world applauds someone, it's usually for what they've done on screen," she began. "But tonight, I want to share why I'm standing here, not as an actress, not as a friend, but as someone who's witnessed a man carry kindness like a second skin." She paused, her eyes finding Keanu in the crowd. "This award isn't just for a career of success, but for a lifetime of quiet service. For the hospitals you supported in silence, For the letters you answered personally. For the boy who handed you a mango when you had nothing to give back. And for the millions who will never know your name but feel your impact. The room was still. And for me, she said, her voice trembling slightly, this award means something else. It means that love, real, enduring love, can still rise after long silences. That kindness is not a show. It's a choice. And Keanu Reeves has made that choice every single day. The applause came not like thunder, but like waves, gentle, rising, reverent. Keanu rose from his seat and walked to the stage, each step slow and certain. He hugged her, not as a partner in performance, but as a man who had finally been seen. Fully. And when he turned to the microphone, there was a softness in his voice that felt like both velvet and gravity. I've never felt comfortable with praise, he said quietly. But if there's anything I've learned, it's that the most powerful thing we can do is show up. Not just on stages, not just when we're celebrated, but especially when no one is watching. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room filled with scarred children, elderly war survivors, and exhausted peace workers. You are the heroes. I'm just trying to follow your lead. The applause swelled again, but something else was coming. As the ceremony moved toward a close, a young woman in a pale scarf stood from the front row. She was not scheduled to speak, but she stepped forward with quiet urgency, holding a small notebook against her chest. Security hesitated, but Sandra raised a hand gently. Let her. The woman stepped onto the stage and faced Keanu, her eyes full but fearless. My name is Layla, she said, her accent thick but her words clear. I met you in 2009. I was just a girl then. I had lost my family in Aleppo. I was at a shelter where you visited quietly without cameras. You sat on the floor with us. You listened. And when I asked you if kindness ever gets tired, you said, only when it forgets how to rest in love. I wrote that down. She held up the notebook, now weathered and stained. I carried that with me through everything. It helped me become a trauma therapist. I now help children find their voices again, because of something you said in passing, because you saw me. The room, already breathless, now sat in sacred stillness. Sandra had tears in her eyes. Keanu stepped forward, his voice a whisper. I remember you. Layla smiled, tears rolling. I know. And there it was, a moment not written in any schedule, not rehearsed in any green room, not built for any camera, but destined. A loop of kindness closing years later. A seed finally grown into a tree. After the ceremony, the reception was quiet, elegant, understated. Keanu and Sandra stood by a window overlooking Lake Geneva, neither saying much. The sky outside was streaked with twilight. He turned to her. I keep thinking, all those years we spent trying to move on, we never moved forward. Sandra looked up at him, her voice barely a breath. But we're moving now. He nodded, and she added with a half-smile, and for the record, I never stopped hoping you'd remember me too. They didn't need to kiss. They didn't need to pose. They just stood there, two souls who had carried loneliness with grace, now learning what it meant to put it down together. The words that weren't supposed to be said. It was supposed to be just another quiet interview, tucked between larger political headlines and lighter pop culture buzz. A respected morning anchor, a small audience, a modest stage. Keanu Reeves had agreed to appear on Voices of Tomorrow, not to promote a film or a product, but to speak about the newly launched foundation, Hearts Without Borders, which had begun expanding into regions devastated by post-war trauma and poverty. The foundation, which he and Sandra co-chaired now, was already helping train therapists in Africa, rebuild schools in Yemen, and fly trauma counselors into refugee camps from Ukraine to Sudan. Keanu had asked, no, insisted, that the focus of the interview be on the children, the real heroes, not him. But sometimes the universe has other plans. The moment he stepped into the studio, dressed in nothing more than a black t-shirt and blazer, no makeup, no filters, the room felt different. Not because of his fame, but because of the weight he carried with such gentleness. The producer later said, when he walks in, it's like the noise inside people just settles. And it was true. Keanu had that rare presence, the kind that didn't scream for attention but called everything around it into stillness. The interview began with ease. He spoke calmly about the projects. He shared gentle stories of children he'd met. He explained how trauma isn't something we move on from, it's something we learn to carry with wisdom. But then the host leaned forward, tilted her head, and said softly, you've always been quiet about your personal life, Keanu. But these past few months, the world has been seeing you differently, with Sandra Bullock, with something that looks like peace. Can we talk about that?" For a second, he didn't respond. He blinked slowly, exhaled deeply. And then, for the first time, not rehearsed, not cleared by PR, not framed for narrative, Keanu Reeves spoke the truth. "I used to think I had to choose between purpose and love," he said, his voice low and reflective. "That if I gave too much of myself to one, I'd lose the other. But I was wrong. Love, real love, it doesn't take from you. It expands your capacity for everything else." The host remained quiet, eyes wide. Keanu continued, "Sandra and I, we've been friends for decades, but sometimes the timing isn't right or the people we are at one point in life aren't ready for what's in front of them. We both went through a lot. Loss, silence, fame, and we both did what people do. We survived, separately, but lately," he looked down, smiling gently, then back up. "Lately, I've realized that peace isn't found by being alone, it's found by being understood." And just like that, without declaring it, without romanticizing it, Keanu Reeves told the world something sacred, that he was no longer walking alone. Sandra was watching live. She sat in the living room of her home in Los Angeles, barefoot in jeans and a hoodie, coffee cooling on the table beside her. She had not known what he would say. They had agreed to keep things personal to protect what they were rebuilding. But when she heard those words, heard him describe her not as a headline but as home, something inside her cracked open. And that's when she picked up her phone and did something neither of them had done in years. She posted a photo. No caption. Just a quiet, blurry picture of their hands interlocked on the edge of a park bench. Nothing posed, nothing polished. The world didn't need an explanation. The world just needed something real. It went viral in minutes, of course. But it didn't matter. Because what followed wasn't just a storm of likes or celebrity gossip. It was something deeper. People from every continent began posting their own photos of holding hands with their elderly parents, their disabled children, their partners battling cancer, their lost friends they were finally reconnecting with. The tag "Hands That Heal" exploded, not in vanity, but in shared humanity. And somewhere in the ocean of that global ripple, something shifted. The story wasn't about Keanu and Sandra anymore. It was about all of us. Later that week, they were invited to close a humanitarian storytelling festival in Berlin. Originally, they were only supposed to deliver closing remarks. But as Keanu stepped up to the podium, Sandra beside him in a soft ivory blouse and blue jeans, the room went utterly silent before a word was even spoken. And Keanu did something unexpected. He stepped away from the mic and invited Sandra to speak first. She hesitated, only slightly, then smiled at him, that quiet, knowing smile that only someone who has seen you at your worst and still believes in your best can give. She turned to the audience and began. "Stories save lives, not because they fix us, but because they remind us we're not the only ones breaking. For years, I buried myself in silence. I performed, I smiled, I raised my children, I did everything right on paper, but inside I was hollow, until someone who had seen that hollow space before without trying to fill it simply sat with me again." Her voice broke slightly. "Keanu didn't come back into my life to rescue me. He came back to remind me that I never had to be perfect to be worthy of love, that I could be messy and tired and honest and still be enough." The crowd didn't erupt into cheers. They rose in silence. They stood with hearts cracked open, tears running freely, not because of fame, but because of resonance. Because someone had finally said it, on a global stage, that it was okay not to have healed perfectly, that it was okay to still be in the process of becoming. And then Keanu stepped forward again. "This isn't about romance," he said, his voice warm and grounded. "This is about relationship with yourself, with others, with truth. We've spent too long wearing perfection like armor. Maybe it's time to just hold each other again." In the hours after the event, donations to trauma centers, shelters, and youth programs surged. Sandra and Keanu didn't attend any after-parties. Instead, they slipped away, back to their hotel, sat on the balcony, and watched the city lights shimmer over the river. Keanu poured them each a glass of wine. Sandra curled into the seat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Until she whispered, "You weren't supposed to say all that." He looked at her, a small smile tugging at the edge of his lips. "I wasn't supposed to love you for 20 years either." And with that, for the first time in 2 decades, they kissed. Not with fire, not with fanfare, but with the peace of two souls who had finally arrived at the same place, together. The quietest room, the loudest love. It had been 3 weeks since Berlin. 3 quiet weeks filled not with fanfare or press tour, but slow mornings, unplugged afternoons, and the kind of conversations that stretch between two people like bridges over wounds they once carried alone. The world, for once, respected the silence. No paparazzi hounded their home. No scandal-hungry tabloids dared to twist what had become something too sacred to frame. Everyone seemed to understand what Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had rediscovered was not a spectacle. It was a restoration of trust, of time, of truth. They spent their days building something few people in Hollywood dared to dream of. Not just a foundation for change, but a legacy of presence. Together, they quietly expanded hearts without borders into a living organism of empathy. Schools that trained former refugees to become counselors. Mobile mental health clinics that rolled into disaster zones. Scholarships named not after the donors, but after children who once had no names in records. And while the world applauded their public grace, it was in private that something truly rare was taking shape. A partnership untouched by ego. Then came the invitation. It was from a children's hospital in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a place where Keanu had once secretly funded the building of a pediatric trauma wing after overhearing a story during a filming layover in 2015. The staff had since named the wing Sala de Esperança, Room of Hope, though he never let them use his name. But now, nearly a decade later, one of the children who had once been admitted into that very wing was now in medical school herself. Her name was Sophia. She was 21, and she had just received a diagnosis of a rare autoimmune disorder that was slowly robbing her of mobility. Her only request before her next surgery: to meet the man who built the room that saved my life. Keanu didn't hesitate. Neither did Sandra. They flew down the next day quietly without alerting the media. No entourage, just a translator, a bouquet of wildflowers, and a small leather notebook full of letters from other children who had written to them after Berlin. The hospital was tucked between two aging neighborhoods, surrounded by murals and noise and life. And yet inside the Room of Hope, the world seemed to soften. The nurses lined the hallway not to gawk, but to welcome them as if they were returning family. Keanu and Sandra walked slowly through the corridor, hand in hand, past drawings on walls, wheelchairs with superhero stickers, IV poles decorated with cartoon ribbons. And then they reached the door. Sophia was sitting up in bed, dark hair in braids, eyes wide and bright with the kind of clarity only people who have known fear too young often carry. When she saw Keanu, her hand flew to her mouth. When she saw Sandra beside him, she gasped and whispered, "You're both real." Keanu approached, crouched beside her bed, took her hand and said softly, "I'm more real in places like this than I ever was on any screen." Sophia laughed, tears already gathering. "I was scared to wake up from surgery and forget who I am, but now I think I'll just remember this moment." Sandra sat on the edge of the bed and pulled from her coat pocket a folded paper. One of the letters from another little girl named Elena in Ukraine who wrote, "Tell the girl you're visiting that she's one of the stars in our sky now." They read it aloud together. By the time they finished, even the doctors in the corner were crying. But the most powerful moment came next. Sophia pulled out a photo, a faded one from a small notebook. It showed the old wing years ago with a man standing beside a nurse. It was grainy, low light, but unmistakable. It was Keanu. He had been there, before cameras, before awards, just there. "You've always been showing up," Sophia whispered. "I think your love saved more people than you'll ever know." Keanu didn't speak. He couldn't. His eyes were glassy, lips trembling. Sandra reached over, gripped his wrist, grounding him. And then in the quietest moment, Sophia looked at both of them and asked, "Do you love each other?" Keanu looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at Keanu. And neither of them laughed. Neither of them deflected. They didn't need to. Sandra spoke first, "Yes." Keanu added, "But not the way you see in movies." Sophia nodded, wise beyond years. The movies end when the good part begins. They stayed with her for 2 hours, talking about nothing and everything, books, dreams, fears, memories. Before leaving, Sandra leaned down and said, "One day you'll be the one holding someone's hand like this." Sophia smiled through her oxygen mask. "I already am." When they stepped out into the warm Brazilian night, neither of them said a word for a while. They walked to a quiet courtyard behind the hospital, lit by a single overhead lamp and the silver breath of the moon. There were no cameras, no applause, just two people changed by the silence. Then Keanu turned to her. Do you ever think all the years we lost were just making space for this? Sandra inhaled slowly. I used to mourn them, but now I'm just grateful we made it through them. He took her hands, both of them, held them in the way someone holds an anchor, not a possession. I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to keep thinking there'll be a better moment, a clearer time, a safer season. I want this, all of it. The quiet, the chaos, the second chances. I want it with you. She looked at him, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with the kind of peaceful certainty that only arrives when you've already decided long ago. So do I, she whispered. And with that, under the faint sounds of a hospital lullaby playing through the windows, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock sealed not a performance, not a fairy tale, but a truth they had been walking toward for a lifetime. A love that didn't need to be loud. A legacy that didn't need to be famous. Weeks later, when they announced their decision to step back from the public eye, not out of exhaustion, but to live more intentionally, the world did erupt. It exhaled. People understood, because they had given the world more than enough. Their final appearance wasn't on a red carpet or a talk show, but in a photograph published quietly by the Hearts Without Borders website, a candid shot of the two of them sitting in a hospital room, holding hands, smiling at a child's drawing taped to the wall. No logos. No filters, just peace. And beneath the photo, 4 simple words. The work continues, together,